which is, I must say, a big honor for me to moderate. Probably you have imagined by looking at my title and also the topic of this lecture that I'm not an expert when it comes to outsourcing, but I see my role here as to really ask questions and provide also the opportunity for some, I think what will be fascinating interaction amongst the panelists, as well as hopefully some fascinating interaction with the audience. We have about an hour, so I'd like to begin by reserving the first discussions or questions for the panel, and then immediately after invite the audience to be as active as possible. And asking questions, in debating. It would be very boring if we all shared the same opinion. So I'm looking forward also to some good debate and discourse. I would like to begin, first I will read the name of the panel, Outsourcing in the Defense Sector. Now, outsourcing, I did a little bit of research, is nothing new in the sense it actually goes back, technically you could go back to, let's say, Ramses II's 13th century Egypt, ancient Greeks, Romans, Alexander the Great, popes since about 1506, Napoleon, George Washington. So this is not a new phenomenon, but this is something that's getting a lot of media recently in the sense, what is really the role of the private sector? Is, let's say, the military something that one can outsource? What are the disadvantages of this? What are the risks? Are we just exporting or outsourcing casualties? Is this something that should be considered as a viable option? So I thought, since we have a fairly diverse panel, and I think I'll begin with the ladies first with a question. I wanted to share a quote with you from someone who has influenced, I think, many trains of thought, and even you could argue from cultural diplomacy is also important, Machiavelli. He had a great quote in The Prince where he was discussing also this issue of outsourcing and mercenaries, and I thought it might be an interesting way to begin the discussion and then ask for maybe some general introductory words from each side. So Machiavelli says the following: "The mercenaries and auxiliaries are useless and dangerous, and if anyone supports his state by the arms of mercenaries, he will never stand firm or sure, as they are disunited, ambitious, without discipline, faithless, bold amongst friends, coward amongst enemies, and they have no fear of God and keep no faith with men." So this is obviously a strong statement from Machiavelli about mercenaries, or this idea of outsourcing. I'd be very curious to hear, from your own points of view, how is this issue of outsourcing perceived? For example, in Greece, Your Excellency, if we could begin with you, how is this issue of outsourcing perceived in Greece? Is this a big topic of debate, and if so, why?
Thank you very much. This is a very challenging question in respect of the public dialogue in Greece. Now, I think one of the most important steps to take towards answering this would be to tackle in a different way what we would call military or civilian outsourcing. And all right, in that respect, I would venture into half agreeing with Machiavelli. Certainly, this is a very strong statement that you cannot actually rely on outsourcing. But if we speak about purely military, then the relation between government, state, and their military people can certainly not be replaced by any such mercenaries. But by the same respect, when we speak about outsourcing in secondary military capabilities, or outsourcing in respect of development, and the capacity of building or rebuilding a country, then we can certainly rely on the services of the private sector. To my opinion, it's the only way to push forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Daniel, I'd like to ask you, do you agree with Machiavelli? Are mercenaries useless and dangerous? Is there a role that also this outsourcing can play? For example, your own experience and maybe the perspectives of NATO.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Well, what Afghanistan proves, I think, is if you want to do counterinsurgency properly, or at least as best as possible, you need to provide the right amount and right kind, actually, of resources. And as I said this morning, actually, this has started to be the case as far as NATO's engagement in Afghanistan is concerned, a little bit less than a year ago. The reason why I'm starting actually with this premise is because NATO itself has to undergo this process that we call of military transformation that has direct financial implications also for financing NATO's own missions. First of all, let's start from the assumption that until recently, there was simply no need for what we call nowadays the so-called deployable capabilities. I mean, the concept of defense was pretty much anchored to a static conceptualization of defense. Now, there is a tendency actually to invest more on what we call the transformational capabilities that allow actually the command structure of an entire institution like NATO to be actually deployed in a very remote theater of operations and be provided actually with the means actually to sustain a long-term effort such as the one in Afghanistan. Well, the problem of all this is that still the financial mechanisms are not geared up to the current requirements. In NATO, there is still the principle that we call the cost lies where it falls, which means that a country in a multinational mission provides a certain capability. That could be a hospital or could be a transportation company, call it whatever you want. Yet that specific country will have to sustain actually the cost to deploy that capability, to manage that capabilities until the duration of the operation, and at the same time knowing that that capability will be used by either troop contributing nations and perhaps also by other interlocutors on the ground. So there is a lot of attention within the institution to actually focus more, I think, on this concept of pooling of resources, particularly with respect to logistical capabilities, which by definition are collective capabilities. So this is actually, I think, the first challenge that NATO itself has to go through, you know, how to sync up, if you wish, or how to adapt its financial policy to properly finance and sustain long-term operations. The other side of the equation is actually how we continue actually to sustain our engagement in an area of crisis like, for instance, Afghanistan, once the so-called kinetic phase, the combat phase actually is finished. Because this morning we talked about a transition, and assuming that transition will go as planned, well, once the force of the security forces of Afghanistan on the ground have the autonomy to address the full gamut of security responsibilities, there is then another challenge, and that is to ensure actually that they fit into a proper defense or, broader speaking, security establishment. Now, in this respect, NATO has created what we call a trust fund with contribution from different ISAF troop contributors to essentially sustain the Afghan National Army. Now, according to the figures I have, this trust fund accounts for approximately between 125 and 130 million US dollars committed out of 150 million pledged to sustain the Afghan National Army. This is something that will require continuous attention by the institution, because at the end of the day, as I said, the specific value added that NATO can bring on the ground, particularly with respect to Afghanistan, is defense reform. And if you want to make actually defense reform sustainable, well, you have to provide the adequate resources. There is, however, a third element that I think starts to emerge from our experience in Afghanistan, and again is I think, the consequence of what it means counterinsurgency. And that is the contracting aspects of counterinsurgency. Time and time again, actually, there has been a tendency, actually, to invest on actors rather than Afghan actors, Afghan companies, in order to provide some sort of economic benefit. Well, this has not been carried out through the appropriate checks and balances, and has created, not voluntarily, but perhaps by default, a situation of a proliferation of subcontractors, actually, that did not allow, in the end, the money actually to reach the targeted beneficiaries. So an important aspect that is being developed in Afghanistan is what we call the so-called Afghan first policy. A higher degree of attention, actually, to use Afghan companies in support to our operations. For instance, there are examples of Afghan companies now making boots for the Afghan National Army. That is the kind of endeavor that we have to continue to foster in order to make sure that our presence brings a lasting contribution also from an economic viewpoint. But then there is a final aspect, and I will stop here, and that I think goes beyond, I think, the NATO funding of the security sector reform in Afghanistan. And that is, I think, the broader donor community approach with respect to development in Afghanistan. And I think the Kabul conference in July this year provided an important impetus in terms of making the donor community ready, actually, to channel more money through the Afghan core budget. And in fact, the most interesting deliverables in this respect of the Kabul conference were the commitments by the donor community within 2 years to raise up to 50% of the assistance budget through the Afghan core budget, and also within the same time span to rise up to 80% of the out-of-budget assistance in a way that that assistance is aligned with the national priority programs that the Afghan government has tabled for endorsement at the Kabul conference. We started actually to make some movement in this respect, but I think a lot of work still remains to be done. So the jury is indeed still out there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I think the key word is what you said there, efficiency. And I think there I'd be very warmly welcome the comments also of Mr. Mutafchiev, who's actually coming from the private sector. So I think in that sense, your perspectives are very important to complement this panel. Was Machiavelli right? Is this idea of outsourcing useless and dangerous? Or are there some things where actually the private sector is maybe more efficient than the public sector? And is this perhaps a better allocation of funding also to bring in Afghan partners, as Daniel was saying? Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I will continue Bulgarian. Okay.
No, please go ahead.
Препратката към Макиавели беше интересна. Аз не мога да кажа дали нещо е напълно черно или напълно бяло, когато говорим за аутсорсинга. Тук искам да направя една връзка с начина, по който доктор Passy презентира, т.е. представи първия панел, където имаше доста разнородни представители, както от дипломацията, така от бизнеса, така от политиката. Мисля, че в този панел по един или друг начин сме се събрали пак разнородни хора. Има представители на НАТО, нейно превъзходителство Kumanaku, която е посланник. Така че мисля, че се чуват различни виждания по въпроса за аутсорсинга в областта на сигурността, в областта на отбраната. Нашата представа, аз съм представител на частна фирма, която се занимава с комуникации, с мрежи, комуникационни решения. Нашата представа за това доколко полезен може да бъде аутсорсинга ще се опитам да представя в следващите минути. При всички положения компания като нашата трудно може да бъде полезна в военни операции или в същинската дейност на Министерството на отбраната, каквато доколкото разбирам и виждам, тази дейност с нашите мисии, които са в Афганистан и преди това, се изпълнява доста добре, очевидно. Искам да направя едно обяснение каква връзка ние виждаме в тази тема за аутсорсинг в конференция, която е свързана с темата за Афганистан. Една тема, която безспорно аз оцених на тази конференция сутринта, че нямам достатъчно информация, че не съм запознат достатъчно добре, както и се оказа, може би, че цялата общественост не е запозната, но къде е връзката между аутсорсинга и темата за Афганистан? Нашето разбиране е, че както всяка една дейност, така и дейностите, които извършва Министерството на отбраната, съгласно стратегията за национална сигурност, съгласно тази бяла книга, която ще се гласува сега, нашата идея е, че всеки трябва да се занимава с това, което разбира. В този смисъл Министерството на отбраната, да речем, както върши добре своите дейности по охраната на държавната сигурност и на държавните граници и също доста успешно участва в международните мисии, мироопазващи мисии в рамките на НАТО. Това, което този аспект на аутсорсинга, който ние искаме да засегнем, е, че частният бизнес може да бъде в подкрепа на някои дейности, които са странични от основната дейност, говорим за Министерството на отбраната, и в частност, примерно, поддръжката на комуникационни и информационни технологии. Смятаме, че ако това не може да стане за ден-два, това не е станало за ден-два и в западните държави. Просто с нашето участие ние се опитваме да създаваме една чуваемост по тази тема, тъй като вярваме, че това е верният начин. По начина, по който ние предлагаме да се работи, ще има ползи както за правителството, както за Министерството за осъвременяване на комуникационните и информационните системи, които те ползват, и по този начин те ще могат да може да се фокусира Министерството върху основната дейност, която е опазването на държавните граници на държавата, както участието в мироопазващи акции. Може би по-късно в дискусията може и да дадем някакви примери, но това е причината, поради която ние участваме тук, и разбира се, благодарение на любезната покана на доктор Passy. Смятаме, че по този начин бизнесът може да бъде полезен индиректно, както и разбира се по начините, които биха засегнати по време на панела по откриването, чрез участие директно в дейностите по възстановяването конкретно на Афганистан, след като, надявам се съгради стабилността на институциите в Афганистан, което в момента е в процес. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'd actually like to pick up just where you left off, in particular with this issue of examples. I think we have a fascinating panel where we have on the one hand the national level represented with the Ambassador of Greece, on the other hand the multilateral level with NATO, as well as the private sector. So I'd like to get a little bit more detailed now and ask each of you, if possible, to give one or two examples of, let's say, a success or a failure where outsourcing either worked or didn't work in your own capacities, in your own experience. And before I ask you to give us a few of these examples, I want to read for you a definition. So this is actually now Article 47 of the 1977 Protocol 1 to the Geneva Convention, which is actually the most widely accepted definition in terms of outsourcing or mercenary. So I'll read this to you, even though I'm recognizing the fact that today we're talking much more than just mercenaries, also civil society and a variety of other capacities. But I thought we could begin with this example, and I'd love to hear from you, a few examples of successes or failures that we can then debate and discuss. So a mercenary is any kind of person who A, is specially recruited locally or abroad in order to fight in an armed conflict. B, does in fact take a direct part in the hostilities. C, is motivated to take part in the hostilities essentially by the desire for private gain, and in fact is promised by or on behalf of a party to the conflict material compensation substantially in excess of that which is promised or paid to combatants of similar ranks and functions in the armed forces of the party. D, is neither a national of a party to the conflict, nor a resident of the territory controlled by a party to the conflict. E, is not a member of the armed forces of a party to the conflict. And F, has not been sent by a state which is not a party to the conflict on official duty as a member of its armed forces. So there are many examples, obviously, where this directly applies and less directly applies. But one quote I wanted to share with you, which is quite interesting from my own country, the United States, the case of Halliburton, So a single company, Halliburton, and its divisions grossed between 13 and 16 billion from the Iraq War, an amount 2.5 times America's cost for the entire Gulf War. So just to show you an example, these are big amounts of money, these are big amounts of outsourcing taking place in a lot of different examples. So that's one example I wanted to just share to get things going. But I'd be happy to hear, on the one hand, some Greek perspectives, NATO perspectives, and private sector. Let's talk about some concrete examples. Where has this worked or where hasn't this worked? If possible, maybe again, I'll begin ladies first. Your Excellency, if you wouldn't mind sharing with us, one or two examples from your own perspective from Greece, we would be very grateful.
Well, thank you for the ladies first. Outsourcing. In respect of Greece's military contribution to Afghanistan and ISAF, all units and personnel belong to Greece's military. So no outsourcing there. But as I said before, there has been, in a larger sense, what you would call outsourcing in respect of NGOs' participation in development parameters in Afghanistan. Certainly, something that should be noted is that depending on the military situation, these NGOs had to depart the country, and I can only say off the cuff that they would be willing to and ready to return should the security parameters considered appropriate in respect of their personal safety. Certainly, it is not only safety of the persons involved, but the political environment that is also important, so that these people would be in a position to perform their duties. I will be very happy if you give me the opportunity later on to touch upon Greece's contribution, not as much as the military capabilities in respect, since like Bulgaria, we're a small country and our resources are quite limited. But as you all know, we were forthcoming in participating in ISAF from the very beginning. But I would like to touch upon our contribution in respect of development, and certainly through our participation in the European Union, like Bulgaria, and the great benefits of this contribution to sustaining Afghanistan as a country. Thank you very much.
All right, so I will come back to you then on that question right after. But first, maybe Daniel, if you could share one or two successes or failures where outsourcing has worked or has not worked.
Well, I will start actually with two cases of lessons learned, and then I will move to two cases of what we may consider a success. The first case of lessons learned concerned the perceptions that many Afghan officials whom we met on a regular basis had about the provincial reconstruction teams, for instance. The Afghan interlocutors were adamant that the PRTs were indispensable and will continue actually to be indispensable from an Afghan perspective for two simple reasons. They provide security, but also they provide access to funding. But time and time again, actually, Afghan officials have essentially pointed out that, albeit necessary, the work of the PRTs actually has, I repeat, from their perspective, not be properly coordinated with the authorities at the subnational level. And we can, spend an entire week to provide the specific examples of a school built without any consultation whatsoever with the local community that ended up as an empty building, essentially, with no books and no teachers. Or we can mention, for instance, a road rehabilitation project, actually, that essentially angered the local community because the local community could not move by cars but only by donkeys, and the wheels actually of the donkeys got broken because they could not sustain actually the paved road. The second example, I think, of lessons learned obviously has to do with training of the Afghan National Security Forces. And again, let's try to put things into perspective. NATO now has the so-called NATO training mission to Afghanistan, but the training of the Afghan National Security Forces has only recently begun to be institutionalized. Now, previous efforts were commendable, were undertaken with goodwill, but they, by default, provided some less than satisfactory results. For instance, in terms of not having a standardized model of training, or not paying enough attention to literacy courses as part of the curriculum to train Afghan National Army and Afghan National Police. And if the chair allows me, I like to dwell on this aspect, because this is what Lieutenant General Caldwell, who is the commander of the NATO training mission to Afghanistan, clearly pointed out in a recent visit to NATO headquarters. There was an operation launched in a given area of Afghanistan, conducted very, very effectively by an Afghan company, clearly in the lead. The Afghan company was ambushed at a certain point and had to call for what we call in extremis support from ISAF. The soldiers were extremely brave, they were extremely effective at what they were supposed to do, but none of them could read a map. Result, they could not even tell the grids via radio to ISAF troops in order for them to be saved. End result, 2 of them got killed. Actually got wounded, but because of the delay in the assistance, there was not enough time actually to save these people, and therefore those 2 soldiers became another died out of woods, which is an awful military acronym that quite often appears on the daily briefings. Now, going to the positive side, I think, of the coin, certainly a national program that the Afghans ask us to continuously support is the National Solidarity Program. This is a program run by the Ministry of Rural Rehabilitation and Development with the use of a grant provided by the World Bank, which finances development projects at the grassroots level decided by the local communities. That's the best example of an alignment, actually, of external funding with what the people on the ground really need. The second good example, of course, is the NATO training mission to Afghanistan. Again, we are just at the beginning of a long and winding road, for lack of a better expression. But certainly, nowadays, there is, first of all, a more standardized model, and there is also a more calibrated balance between quantity and quality. Because frankly speaking, it's ultimately quality that counts if we look at a lasting solution. The final comment I'd like to make has to do with another, I think, interesting development that, in my personal and humble opinion, deserves systematic attention from the donor community, and that is the implementation of the subnational governance policy. This is a document approved by the Afghan government, which will require an astronomical amount of parliamentary work to essentially either amend existing laws or adopt new laws to properly implement it. But it is the framework necessary, first of all, to better understand for us who's doing what in the Afghan side at the local level. The problem in that respect is that provincial and district governors do not have yet the level of budgetary autonomy that they require in order to A, coordinate more effectively with the donor community, and B, have a better leverage vis-a-vis the local communities once they make certain promises. Thank you very much. I'm sorry to be
Well, thank you. Very much the same challenges facing civil society, the challenge of coordination, the one level and the other, but not symbolic only to the public sector. I'd be very pleased now in terms of also the private sector examples to ask you also to give us maybe, let's say, 2 examples, if possible, of maybe some successes or failures where outsourcing makes sense or does not make sense.
Аз ще дам примери. В началото искам, в началото на този отговор, искам да кажа няколко думи за аутсорсинга сам по себе си. Това е някакъв термин, който изглежда сложно, който изглежда неразбрано може би за всички, но като цяло аутсорсинга е въпрос съотношение цена-качество. И разбира се има и други аспекти, които са доверието, но ще се опитам да дам един много такъв прост пример с лекарите и с лекуването и с лечението. Преди време, може би столетия, хилядолетия, хората са се лекували сами. Ходили са, събирали са билки, мазали са с някакви треви и така нататък. В един момент се е появила необходимостта от някаква по-висока експертиза, по-висока специализация, са почнали да се появяват врачките, знахарите и там другите лечители, които са започнали да лекуват хората. Тоест появила се необходимост, тъй като това лечението, медицината е отговорна работа, се е появила необходимост някой да инвестира в своето обучение, да го обучава дълго време, за да може да дава някакъв по-специализиран продукт. И така, де-факто, хората са аутсорснали грижата за здравето си. Разбира се, те биха могли да продължат да се грижат със собствени усилия, да не носят на знахаря кокошки, петли, каквото е било необходимо да му се заплаща, но по другата страна качеството, което са получавали от грижите сами за себе си, е било достатъчно прекалено ниско, затова са се обръщали към лекарите. Правя този паралел заради начина, по който ние действаме в момента като частни компании. Ще дам един пример за успешен аутсорсинг и то е в област в комуникациите, където България смея да твърде на доста високо ниво технологично. Няма да казвам името на компанията, тъй като мисля, че имаме клаузи в договора за конфиденциалност, но все пак голям телеком, в който ние успяваме да му предоставяме услуги, които са тясно специализирани по изграждане на мрежата, пълен аутсорсинг на тези дейности, благодарение на което бенефициентът, получателът на тези услуги, клиентът, получава по-ниска себестойност на услугите, които получава и все пак по-високо качество или същото качество на услугите, които е получавал, когато е правил с собствени ресурси. Разбира се, тук не е само съотношението цена-качество, тук има и фактора доверие. Тъй като както ние имаме доверие на лекаря да отидем и да му поверим грижите за здравето си, така по същия начин е много важно да има доверие между клиента и доставчика, тъй като не винаги и не всички случаи на аутсорсинг са успешни. Може дълго да говорим на това, не искам да влизам в тази тема за неуспешните аутсорсинги, просто ще покажа няколко примери също от България. Да речем, първите успешни примери на аутсорсинг в България да бяха де-факто, когато западни компании, най-вече софтуерни компании, разбраха, че в България има сравнително ефтин, сравнително с западния ресурс, сравнително ефтини програмисти, които дават достатъчно добро качество. Да, доверието се изгради по-късно с течение на работа. Но това е начинът, по който малко или много в България се разбира аутсорсинга. Идват едни западни компании, правят тук кол-центрове, което не е лошо, напротив, това е доста добре, дава работни места, дава бизнес, дава заплати. Но това е начинът, по който ние го разглеждаме малко или много повече в България. Другия аспект на това, което ние просто с това цялото говорене се опитваме да създадем доверие, да говорим по тази тема, как български компании ще успеят да вземат бизнеса на други български компании, големи или на някакви неприсъщи дейности от government сектора, така че хем да дадат по-добро качество, хем да дадат по-добра цена и да създадат възможности клиентът на тази услуга, бенефициентът, независимо дали ще бъде представител на частния сектор или на държавата, да управлява по-добре ресурсите си във време, където ресурсите очевидно са недостатъчни и да получи същото или по-добро качество за тези свои услуги. Пак казвам, ние в България можем да дадем, мога да дам още един-два примера за успешен аутсорсинг, но по-скоро ми се ще да поговорим за начинът, по който това може да стане, за изграждането на доверие между клиентите. Мисля, че работим в тази посока. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So question number 3 is picking up a little bit where you left off. I'd like to deal for a moment with this question of accountability or neutrality. One of the myths that I am very often confronted with as the head of an NGO is that civil society, they're the good guys, they're the neutral ones, whereas the private sector, they just want to make money. Public sector, they're just following governmental agendas. And there's sort of this myth that NGOs are somehow neutral. And I always try to counter that myth, and I say, in my own opinion, there is no neutrality. In the sense, really, I'm of the opinion every individual, every NGO, every civil society group, every company, every governmental organization, they all have agendas. I think we need to be honest with each other, transparent with each other. That's how it is. We need to accept it. So I think that's the first challenge that I see for civil society, sort of first to accept the fact we have competing agendas, and that's okay. The idea is let's bring these actors together. The more partnership we have, the less of a risk there is to have one agenda overshadow the other. So I'd like to now come to this issue of accountability, in the sense, on the one hand, we've heard here a number of examples, some successes, some failures, where it actually does make sense. You know, let's outsource this to the private sector. The question then comes, are they accountable, or who's accountable? There are many cases where you have private sector companies doing things, actually committing crimes in a variety of countries, and they're not being held up actually to the consequences. They're not being pursued legally. What do we make of that? In the sense, is there a risk? If you have someone who's only there for the money, who's only there for private sector reasons, is that a risk? But you could counter that by saying, is it any different? For example, to take American soldiers, you know, very often American soldiers, when they enlist, are doing so very often for economic reasons, you know, because they want to get a free college education, or they want to get a salary, or this and that. So you could argue, is that any different than, you know, Halliburton or a company going in? I don't know. But I wanted to just pose this question to each of you in terms of, are you concerned with this issue of accountability, or is there some way of grappling with this issue of accountability to make it so that it is more transparent? And I'd like to just ask this to each one of you, in no particular order. Who would like to respond first? The issue of accountability. It's a tough issue, but I think it's crucial. Yeah. Okay, ladies first, please.
Right. As an out-of-the-cuff reaction to what you call accountability, would be to come back to what you have said before about the agendas of NGOs versus to agendas of governments, organizations, and above all the Afghani government, because they are the mainly concerned. Now, in respect of the term accountability, it remains to define whether you speak about political accountability, the military parameter, or the governmental accountability. And as you yourself said, it is a tough issue. If something wrong happens, then you may not be able to pin down anyone accountable if you have so many different layered players converge into actually a limited space, whether it's geographical or political space. Still, it's a limited space. So I don't think you could have an answer to this beforehand. You don't have this weapon in using in good or less good moments. So international community will have to proceed by trial and error. This would be my off-the-cuff reaction to your question. Thank you.
Okay, so learning by doing to a certain degree. I'd be curious to hear what the other panelists think. I mean, is there a legal mechanism that could enforce this? I mean, we could look at, for example, the failure of the Convention on Genocide, where you actually had over 120 countries agreed on this. However, you know, every day countless crimes are happening and nothing is being done. So technically there is a legal mechanism, but actually nothing is being done in so many cases. But what about in this case of outsourcing? Are there legal ramifications or mechanisms we can have? Is it learning by doing? I'd be curious to hear your perspectives to either one of you or both of you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much to the ambassador, actually, for a very pointing remark. And I absolutely agree. It will continue to be learning by doing. But with respect to Afghanistan, I would like to offer actually 4 points, and I try to be as succinct as possible. In Afghanistan, we have different frameworks now where the issue of accountability can be addressed. And I'll try actually to explain them in more details. Well, one framework of accountability is the Kabul process itself. The Kabul process is a commitment by the government of Afghanistan, first of all, to the Afghan population and also to the donor community. But it's also the other way around. It's a commitment that the donor community has made to the Afghan population and also to the Afghan government. Now, the expectation actually that this represents the right framework is because the decision taken at the Kabul conference will be subject to close scrutiny. Every 4 months there will be a meeting at the ambassadorial level to see where the implementation of the Kabul agenda is going. Once a year, at least, there's going to be a meeting at the level of the foreign minister. So through the Kabul process, I think we have now a framework where essentially all the stakeholders have made a political and public commitment to do what each of them is mandated and has the expertise to do. The second framework, I think, of accountability is the contracting guidance on counterinsurgency that General Petraeus himself issued, who will make the commander of PRTs, of regional commands, and also the task forces accountable when it comes to the planification and execution of their operations. I think a third framework of accountability is, in my opinion, the very construct shape, clear, hold, and build which characterize our modus operandi. I, of course, accept the fact that this can be yet another NATO military acronym, but as a matter of fact, actually, I interpret it as a framework of mutual accountability because this construct is a reflection of another lessons that we at NATO has learned from Afghanistan. You do not clear an area unless you have pre-planned the necessary capabilities that other civilians, by the way, are supposed to provide in order to hold that area. Otherwise, you will not be able to sustain a gain that you have done from a military point of view. In concrete terms, this means that in this moment, every operation is planned from its end state backwards. What are we aiming at from that military operations? And this explains why Governor Mangal in Helmand explains to the public on a daily basis the nature of the operation. This explains why Governor Wessa in Kandahar is engaged on a daily basis with the local communities. And I think the fourth framework of accountability is the very process of transition. I think we have not had the chance this morning to dwell into the details of transition, but I think it's important actually to inform as effectively as possible about the criteria that we have to be taken into account to assess the eligibility of a province for transition. One is the security situation on the ground. The other criteria is the capability of the Afghan National Security Forces, but then there are two other criteria that we'll need to take into account. What is the progress of governance and development? Is that progress sufficient enough to essentially capitalize on the military gains? And fourth, are the PRTs and ISAF ready to move more into a more supporting role devoted to building Afghan capacities? So I think that nowadays we have clearer frameworks. Well, the comprehensive approach actually is conceived and implemented through a high number of checks and balances that, frankly speaking, we had before. Thank you.
Thank you very much for also those very specific examples dealing with NATO. Mr. Mutafchiev, should we be concerned as an international community about accountability as we observe more and more outsourcing taking place when it comes to the military? Should we be concerned about accountability?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. За мен лично интересно, дори седяйки тук отпред, да чувам по какви различни начини, нали, гледаме ние на света, хора от различни среди, от различни бизнес, какво ние влагаме под термините отговорност, отчетност или и така нататък. Аз ще се опитам, тъй като съм представител на фирма от телекомуникационния бизнес, да дам един пример за това как ние разглеждаме какъв смисъл ние влагаме в това нещо и как се справяме при работата си с такива клиенти. Идеята за отговорността при работа в аутсорсинга може да го, if I clearly understand your point, actually. Ще дадем един пример с пак една така компания, да речем телекомуникационна. Всяка една телекомуникационна компания има IT инфраструктура с съответните сървъри, бази данни, които могат да бъдат достатъчно важни, може да има лични данни там, достатъчно важни и достатъчно страшно може да бъде, ако са загубени. В случай, че да речем има недобросъвестен служител, който реши да наруши регулациите, да наруши правилата, той може да доведе до изтичане на такава чувствителна информация, била тя лична информация за клиенти, била тя търговска тайна, от което могат да настъпат доста сериозни вреди за компанията. А един такъв служител може да бъде отговорен само в рамките на своята заплата и на своето работно място. От друга страна, така поне както ние разглеждаме моделът на аутсорсинга, когато една компания или една authority, въобще някой отиде и застане пред клиента и каже: аз гарантирам със своето име, със своите банкови референт гаранции, със своите клаузи за Service Level Agreement, не знам как се превежда това на български, но с нивото на услугата, която се предоставя, когато каже: аз гарантирам, че вашите системи ще бъдат наред, ще работят, няма да има изтичане на информация. Ако се случи така, че аз се издъня, банковата сметка е там, има съответните наказания, да не говорим за ущърба, който ще получи компанията от една такава лоша референция. Това е нашия поглед върху нещата, върху отговорността, която ние поемаме спрямо нашите клиенти и спрямо начина, по който мислим, че трябва да се отнасяме към клиентите и въобще към термина отговорност в аутсорсинга. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, would you like to respond? No, I think in many ways I would agree. I think the great thing with the private sector is that in general results matter, deliverables matter. At the end you've got to deliver. If you're given a certain task or outsourced, you've got to deliver that. The risk, of course, is at the end of the day when we ask ourselves who is a private sector company accountable to, it's accountable to its customers or its shareholders, not necessarily to the citizens of Afghanistan or the citizens of any country. And that's, I think, somehow this disconnect that still seems to be open in the sense there needs to be some better, ideally a legal mechanism that can help to prevent if there are certain cases where actually crimes are committed. So I think there's work to be done there. But I'm looking at the clock, and technically we have 5 minutes left. So I would like to almost immediately, turn this to the audience. Beforehand, since we have Her Excellency Kumanaku here, she alluded to this earlier, I'd be very happy if Your Excellency, you might also share a few words with us about also Greece's contribution to the ISAF mission and beyond. Since you're here on the panel, it would be a shame if we didn't also hear a little bit about the Greek contribution, and then perhaps right after that we could then include questions and debates from the audience. Please, Your Excellency.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Some basic thoughts that I would like to share with the audience touch mainly upon the fact that Bulgaria and Greece, being small countries in the region, had to deal with successive issues in order to be able to effectively participate both on the military and the financial level in defending and rebuilding Afghanistan. So I think that, of course, it would be of some interest to present how many soldiers or unit, be it medical or mechanical or the like, my country has dispatched into Afghanistan, and in which regions, agricultural or educational or health program, we are contributing with our modest 80 million throughout these years. But then, by reading my facts and figures, I realized that the added value in respect of Greece's and I would venture to say Bulgaria's presence in Afghanistan is their certainly being members of NATO and ISAF, but the added value is our membership in the European Union. So, with your permission, I would like to touch a little bit on this subject, since it will certainly become more and more important now that we have entered into this almost unimaginable transition phase. And when I say unimaginable, it's when we come to think on how we engaged into Afghanistan 9 years ago. And the development on the ground, both political and military, and it seems that now we have reached this crucial moment where we can tackle the transition, and not only by building the capability of the Afghan National Army, but by actually participating in the development of the country, and by the same occasion by abiding to their, I would say, political culture. So, by just touching upon the issue of the presence of the European Commission in Afghanistan, which apparently dates in the mid-1980s, with an office in Peshawar in western Pakistan. A lot has happened ever since, and we are now in a position, after solving and overcoming substantial obstacles in respect of our common defense and foreign policy, by naming now a high representative, that means a foreign minister for the whole European Union. So we have now come into position where we, the European Union and its member states, are one of the main contributors in rebuilding Afghanistan, touching a sum of a billion, 30 millions of euros until 2017, I think, or 15. Annual, yes, yes. So, of course, there are key priorities for the next period, which have been touched certainly both in London and Kabul conferences, and these touch upon building a stronger state and a stronger society, and they come through the electoral reform, the reconciliation and reintegration, the rule of law, which is the police reform, which is an extraordinary of extraordinary importance for this passage into leaving Afghanistan a safe and democratic place. The actual national capacity building, and the regional cooperation. I would have a lot to say about this, but I rest confident that the representative of the Commission tomorrow will touch largely and extensively upon these subjects. So, from my point of view, it would be extremely interesting to see how European Union will take over this capacity building in the months and in the years to come. So, fellow Bulgarians, stick to the to this very interesting equation through your membership in the European Union, and never say that as a small member state you don't have the capacity to contribute in building democracy and help developing a poor and afflicted country like Afghanistan. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much, Your Excellency. And I'd also like to thank the panel. I think we were able to cover a lot of territory in terms of the issues of definition, some success stories, some failures, as well as the challenges posed also as we address issues such as accountability. So I'd like to thank the panelists very much for that. And I would now immediately like to invite questions, comments, and or debates from the audience. If you could please briefly introduce yourself also, so we know who you are, where you're coming from, and then mention if you'd like to direct a question to someone specific. I see the first few hands in the front row. Please, Bettina.
Can speak? Yeah, it's working. Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Bettina Muscheid. I've come from Brussels, from the European Commission, and I'm really glad that I can join you, in particular for this interesting discussion we started today on outsourcing. And I have a concrete question to NATO. One of the issues that was debated for a long time, and hence my interest in the issue of shoes now being produced in Afghanistan for the army, is, of course, that for a long time these things didn't really happen. I wonder whether there's a reflection in NATO now on the broader hearts and minds to take that very often used term that perhaps we should have earlier, and next time round, if we're there, we should much earlier actually try to not, distribute just aid, but ensure that people are participating in the productive process, that there are benefits very visible. And of course, because we have waited with many, many, many things for a long time, and it's now 10 years down the line, and we wonder what have we done about subnational governance, why is the justice sector lagging behind, and so on and so forth. Perhaps we should have done much earlier something about building up productive capacities instead of importing all the goods. Is there a reflection on that? I would be interested in this.
Yes, Bettina, thank you. There is a reflection indeed, and that's why we put so much emphasis on the Kabul process as the beginning of a process of progressive realignment of our assistance effort with the national priorities. But that has been something that resonated, I think, not only within NATO, but in the broader international community, the EU, the United Nations, and therefore that's why it is more and more important actually to invest on building Afghan capacities. One program, for instance, that NATO is not running directly, because NATO is not the EU, NATO is not the UN, NATO is not the World Bank, but a program that NATO supports is what we call the Civilian Technical Assistance Program. This is a fully fledged Afghan-led program under the leadership of the finance minister, who basically said we need the next X number of mentors, trainers, and technical advisors at different institutions at the central and the subnational level. And it was the same Afghan government that also set the conditions, who these trainers should be. First of all, Afghan, if they have the required expertise, or mentors from the region, including even Pakistan in some cases. Second, people that should be used not just as external consultants that stay for 6 months and then they leave, but rather as people with at least 1 year of commitment that actually mentor an Afghan colleague, so that when they leave, their Afghan counterpart will have already developed the capacity to continue doing the work. This is just an example. Another example is this Afghan first policy, which has been approved by NATO, and which has been to a vast extent reflected in the contracting guidance of General Petraeus. Pay more attention, within limits, of course, to use Afghan companies. And I think even the institution of the establishment of the NATO training mission in Afghanistan has to be seen as an investment not only in terms of lasting security for Afghanistan and for us, but also as an investment with a huge financial return, because at the end of the day, it will certainly be more expensive to continue financing external soldiers rather than financing the building of the Afghan National Army. That in itself, however, continues to require a significant amount of money. The US has already allocated $11 billion for the activities of the NATO training mission to Afghanistan next year. So to summarize, only recently, I think, we have in place the resources to conduct an effective civil and military campaign, and the whole focus is on continuing building Afghan capacities, because if you want to achieve lasting security and not taking shortcuts, you need to invest on Afghan capacities. But this, I'm afraid to say, should not be limited to only what NATO does. I mean, the effort on building capacities has also to inform the activities of other international organizations. And I'm very, very pleased to hear from the ambassador before the enhanced emphasis on building African capacities, and even more, if I may, Ambassador, had a reference to taking into account the Afghan political culture, because at the end of the day, we need to bring the Afghan traditional society into the mainstream.
Thank you very much, Daniel. We're running a little behind schedule, but I want to try to take at least one or two more questions. Next up is our host, actually, Solomon.
Thank you, Chairman. I wanted to share two pieces of experience with you about one example of very appreciated outsourcing. When I became minister in 2001, we continued the reform in the Bulgarian armed forces, and we found that there was big meat processing factories inside the army. Because the belief before that was that this meat is much cheaper if it is produced by the army. And we calculated and found that the meat which you can buy outside is 10 euro, and the meat that you can produce inside the army is 15 euro. So we realized that the job of the militaries is not to produce meat, because among other things, this meat is much more expensive than the one. That's why we decided we have to outsource this. And this was an element of the reforms of the armed forces. Another example of not that much appreciated type of outsourcing is the experience of the British soldiers in India when they used the tribe of Gurkhas, which Gurkhas were subcontracted by the British and were absolutely loyal, absolutely trusted by the Brits, and did an excellent job. And here comes my question to NATO. What is the maximum level of admissible outsourcing in defense which NATO is ready to do? A, and B, what is the next step in outsourcing which we do not have today and NATO believes that we'll have tomorrow?
Dr. Solomon, thank you very much for this question. I simply do not have the element of information to give you a right answer on the maximum level of outsourcing. What I can tell you, however, is that the importance of the private sector in Afghanistan should not go underestimated, provided, however, that we do, as an international community, our utmost to essentially develop the Afghan governance that can create that framework of accountability in order to make sure that the private work actually is conducted in an accountable manner. With respect to your second question, here too, it's quite difficult actually to come up with specific numbers. What I think I can tell actually is Afghanistan aside, there will be, I think, an increasing effort by the alliance to invest more on defense reform activities. But in that respect, actually, we need to remind ourselves first that we need to put more emphasis on collective funding, and that's why the trust funds are so important. And second, make sure that in doing this, we keep our focus on building indigenous sustainable capacities, because the biggest mistake we could make is to create by default a parallel governance structure, which is never sustainable from a variety of viewpoints. I hope I at least partially answer your concerns.
Thank you. Is there a final question before we break for the coffee break? I guess, okay. Don't know. We can take a final 2 questions then, and maybe a closing statement.
My name is Darnell Summers. I'm from Detroit, Michigan. I was in the United States military for 4 years. I'm a Vietnam veteran. My first question is a technical question. During the presentations, the terms terrorists and insurgents have been interchanged. It would seem to me that the word terrorist is more like a judicial term, a police term, and the word insurgent is more a political term, indicating that an indigenous population is either fighting its own government or fighting against a force that it includes its own government and also foreign forces. The other thing is, it surprised me that the question of what was the status in Afghanistan at this particular point, was it war, was it peace? And to answer that question, I think that it's important to understand that just to spout statistical data or empirical data is quite dangerous. Case in point, if I were to say to you that last year, for instance, 16,000 people were killed by gunshot wounds in a particular country, one might assume that a state of war would exist in that particular country. Namely, that country is the United States of America. To put it in perspective, I think in the Civil War, 360,000 people were soldiers, combatants, were lost during the Civil War. I'm not so sure about the First World War, but it was something under 100,000. 178,000 were lost in the Second World War, about 40,000 in the police action in Korea, and then 60,000 in the Vietnam War, which I took part in. If you extrapolate, we have had more in America. We've had more deaths by gunshot than all the wars that the United States has been involved in. Now, certainly, Mr. Riggio, this question is directed at you. You're not suggesting that NATO undertake kinetic exercises against the United States. So, and by the way, the United States is #1 in terms of crimes in the world. And another footnote is that it is #1 in terms of murder by gunfire, and Bulgaria is number 35 with 332. It's the internet is a wonderful thing because you can do some research right here on the spot. So I have an unfair advantage. So there again, the first question was about the terms terrorists and insurgents, and then the question of the situation. What determines what war is and what not? What determines what peace is and what isn't? And also, let me add also that there are definitely 2 types of war, declared and undeclared. You know, but I don't want to get into the history of that. So, and then it seems to me that this conference is one to lay to the Bulgarian people the reasons for involvement in the war. And it's strange for me that I hear some of the same rhetoric that I heard during the Vietnam era, you know, and I'd like you to address that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Darnell. Was there another final question? I don't want to cut anyone off. Or, okay, maybe one final brief question. And then I would suggest I'll give the panelists a chance to briefly respond and at the same time give their closing statement. One more brief question.
Hello, my name's James Hood. I am from Australia. Just regarding outsourcing, I thought we might, well, I guess have missed, the other half of this conversation, which is outsourcing from the other side of this conflict. I am slightly interested in the situation where those people that fight on the side of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda might not actually necessarily be doing so ideologically, but are doing so essentially for financial reasons. And again, to use the oft-said phrase, hearts and minds, whereas in this actual case, and it also relates to where people are growing drug crops instead of, well, an agricultural crop. But this is essentially an issue of stomachs as opposed to, well, beliefs, yeah? So I would just like to get your opinion, again, Mr. Riggio, on what is being done to, deal with that type of outsourcing.
To now give a chance for each of the speakers, if they would like to respond to one or both of those questions, as well as maybe to give a closing statement. We had an interesting idea with the last panel where we had to say what our greatest fear was for Afghanistan. I'd like to flip that around and ask also, what is your greatest hope in the next few years for Afghanistan? So maybe we could go, we'll do reverse order this time. Instead of ladies first, maybe we can begin with you in terms of a closing statement. And, okay, the private sector first, and then we'll come to the public sector. Please, Mr. Mutafchiev.
Благодаря. Финални думи. Виждам, че интересът е насочен повече към Афганистан, което е нормално към теми свързани с Афганистан. Това, което искам да кажа единствено, че частният сектор би могъл и може и би могъл да бъде от полза за военните, за българската армия, доколкото може да поеме неприсъщи дейности, както доктор Passy даде много добър пример с Минското от преди време. Общо взето това илюстрира доста добре и нашата идея. Това от мен. Давам думата на останалите за финални възможности.
Okay, thank you. Daniel, you have some work to do, I think, answering a number of questions, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, sir, for an excellent question. I'll try again to address with as much intellectual honesty as possible. On your question, insurgents versus terrorism, I call it, in extreme synthesis, a marriage of convenience, in the sense that if you neglect a vacuum of governance, if you neglect the issue of the culture of impunity that has existed in Afghanistan for a too long period of time, someone will breach that vacuum. And now we are at the stage where essentially we have insurgents and terrorists fighting in the name of, if you wish, a tactical alliance, because they are both, for lack of a better expression, stakeholders and shareholders of vested interests that they know can be maintained only if they can rely on a perennial, unstable Afghanistan. And then, of course, I could elaborate more, although I try to be as succinct as possible, on the difference, obviously, in terms of how do you military address terrorism and insurgents. And, of course, terrorism is a more, if you wish, intelligence-driven endeavor, whereas counterinsurgency is more, if you wish, a comprehensive effort where you need to make sure that the use of force is attuned to the governance needs that exist on the ground. With respect to your second question, I offer two remarks. First, it's inevitable that with more resources on the ground and with a higher degree of capability to challenge safe havens, there will be a spike of violence. But this is not just the result of what we call an increased operational tempo. It's the result, if you wish, of what I said a couple of seconds ago, that because of a neglection of extended governance vacuum, we now are in a situation that the provision of security outpaces the provision of governance, but the level of confidence of the people lags behind security and governance. That's why you need to continue engaging with the local communities. But when we talk about security, I think, and that's my second remark, we also have to pay attention to what we call the human security concept. For a person in Zabul, it's not just the challenge to the local command and control structure of the Taliban, challenged by the special forces, that counts. What counts is, am I able actually to bring my agricultural products to a closed market? By the way, is there any closed market to my village? If I have a land dispute, do I have the chance to rely on a judge who's not going to be bribed by the local chieftains? If I have to move from point A to B, am I going to be challenged not only by the insurgents, but also by corrupt power brokers on the ground? How many checkposts I will have to go through until I move from point A and point B? This second aspect requires a security footprint, but goes, as you can imagine, well beyond the provision of what we may call hard security. With respect to the third question, the Afghans themselves admit that the vast majority of the insurgency is driven by domestic dynamics and is driven by local grievances that they've not been properly addressed, culture of impunity, and so on and so forth. This determines a situation where most of the indigenous insurgency fight out of economic reasons, and even before that, out of frustrations for not having had his needs met. Some Afghans, when asked, what do you want? They simply answer, I want to be left alone. If I want to move to go to my brother's marriage, I want to make sure that I don't have to bribe the different security checkposts. So there is, of course, an outsourcing from the other side. But I think, and we go back to the issue of capacity building, also a more macro-systemic, if you wish, issue. And that is what the so-called pay and rank reform initiative is all about. If you are a judge that are tasked to go in a very remote district in southern Afghanistan where the level of violence in a multifaceted fashion remains high, and you are told, by the way, you will be paid $70 a month, you will think twice before taking that post. Hence the need actually to boost this process of pay and rank reform, because even if the representatives of the Afghan population have a clear assurance that their grievances actually will be addressed, if they don't have appropriate economic incentives, it would be quite difficult for them to undertake a position of responsibilities. Finally, Mr. Chairman, my hope is based on two very brief considerations. The international community is singing from the same sheet of music. The need for boosting capacities, aligning our effort to the Afghan national priorities, and the need to remain committed for the long haul is not something said only by the Secretary General of NATO. It is also said by UN Special Representative of the Secretary General from Afghanistan, and also from the European Union leadership. The second reason why I am optimistic is because I detect an increasing sense within the region that no one will truly benefit from in Afghanistan in a perennial state of instability. No one except those insurgents and terrorists who, of course, have vested interests that can only be sustained if Afghanistan remains in a stable country. For these two reasons, I remain optimistic. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Your Excellency, Ambassador Kumanaku, please.
I have a lot of respect on the opinion and of the concepts of people who have actually been in Afghanistan. I was thinking by listening to the previous speaker that indeed there is a lot of difference in having been and not having been there. Why would I be optimistic about the outcome of this global international effort? I would be optimistic because we've seen results, and because we seek results. International community in Afghanistan is there to provide all necessary support to ensure the safest and the safest transition. And by safest, I don't only touch upon the parameter of security itself, but of the paramount notion of stability. International community, regional communities cannot afford a destabilized, an eternally destabilized Afghanistan. And I believe that at the end of the day, whereas it comes from small, medium, or big countries, small, medium, or big international organizations, the word is stability, and for this, if both international community and people in Afghanistan are committed, then we're sure to keep on an optimistic stance.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. I think to conclude, I'll quote my colleague from NATO, who in the spirit of cultural diplomacy, I think wrapped up my own hope quite well, that in the future we will be singing from the same sheet of music. So in that sense, if you could all please join me in a very warm applause for the panelists. Thank you.